In the picture, this is Dr. Jessica. Her case was one of the biggest public opinion cases, but what happened from the beginning, and how did it lead to her being killed with 17 stab wounds in front of her children? The one who did it was her husband, Dr. Michael, who is also a doctor. Surely, this didn't happen in a moment of anger. So let's tell the story of what happened with Dr. Jessica. In 2014, in the city of Riverton, Dr. David Clark graduated from the Faculty of Dentistry with top honors. Living in Riverton with his family, who took great pride in him, they were well off financially and could afford to support their son until he became a successful dentist. After graduation, he worked as a teaching assistant at a private dental college and continued his studies to obtain higher academic degrees because of his love for education. David's family believed that since he had completed his studies and become a dentist, it was time for him to get married. Although David was initially against the idea of marriage, he knew deep down that he couldn't say no to his family because they controlled his life completely. On the surface, David appeared to be a strong, diligent person who excelled in his studies and was well regarded among his peers, but those who knew him well understood that his family had a tight grip on him. In 2016, Dr. David met Dr. Jessica, who was also studying at the Faculty of Dentistry, but she was 3 years younger and also his neighbor. Their families knew each other from a distance. David was impressed by her and found out that she came from a very respectable family, being the only daughter with siblings who were also doctors. Her family was well regarded and financially stable, just like David's family. A perfect match. David informed his family, and they were thrilled because they knew Jessica's family well. They decided to visit her family to propose marriage on behalf of their son. During the first visit, both families presented themselves in the best possible manner. Jessica's family was very straightforward from the beginning, whereas David's family only pretended to be. The visit was successful, allowing the two families to get to know each other better and feel comfortable. Thus, they agreed on the marriage between David and Jessica. Dr. David informed Jessica's family that he had an apartment in his family's house in Riverton and that he had ambitions to expand and establish his private clinic soon. Jessica's family felt that David was a suitable match due to their similar cultural and social backgrounds, as well as his ambition and success in his career. Because Jessica was their only daughter, her family was willing to do anything to make her happy. Despite it being an arranged marriage, Dr. Jessica was also impressed by Dr. David's demeanor, success, and ambition, so she agreed to the marriage. Both families agreed that all stages of the marriage would be completed within a year. However, shortly before the wedding, Dr. David met with Jessica's family to inform them that he had spent a lot of money preparing for the marriage and didn't have any funds left to cover the wedding expenses. Jessica's family decided to cover all the wedding costs, and Dr. David was delighted. At the time, no one thought David's behavior was strange. They just assumed his financial situation had become difficult due to the marriage expenses. They were unaware that this was a significant sign of the future that lay ahead. They held the wedding, and Dr. Jessica moved into Dr. David's apartment in his family's house in Riverton. After just 1 week of marriage, Dr. Jessica noticed that his family interfered in everything and that he had no say or ability to object or express his opinion on anything. After some time, she tried to adapt to the situation, hoping that with time she could influence Dr. David's thinking and change the ways she didn't like. A year passed, and during that year, they were blessed with their first child. However, numerous conflicts and problems arose between Dr. Jessica and Dr. David. These were not the typical issues that occur in the first year of marriage. David was very violent and short-tempered, contrary to the image he presented to others. Jessica's problems were not just about the family's interference, but also about David's excessive anger and violence towards her and their new baby. The family's interference became unbearable, and Jessica couldn't stand living like that anymore. At the beginning of their second year of marriage, Jessica asked David to move to a different place where they could live together away from his family. David didn't give her any response at the moment and said he needed time to think. In reality, David didn't think. He went to his family and told them what Jessica had asked. Naturally, his family refused Jessica's request, saying things like, "Is Jessica going to dictate what happens now?" In a typical situation, a family would try to resolve the issues between their son and his wife. However, David's family didn't even consider doing that. Despite Jessica being a very good wife, a respectful woman, and an excellent mother, none of these qualities mattered to them. The only thing that did was getting their way. Dr. Jessica started confiding in her mother about the problems between her and Dr. David, including the family's interference in their lives. Initially, she talked about the arguments and violence, but didn't mention the bigger issue she felt in their lives. Dr. David was very stingy with her and their children. Jessica didn't know how to bring up this subject because she found it very embarrassing, as did many others. Her family was genuinely respectable, so her mother advised her to calm down, saying it was natural for couples to face problems, especially early in their marriage. Another year passed and they were blessed with another child, but this child had a health problem requiring him to stay in an incubator for medical care. The incubator was costly and David, who was a doctor and worked in his own clinic, refused to pay, claiming financial difficulties. Jessica's family stepped in again, covering the expenses. When the funds ran out, David decided to take his son out of the incubator despite the child not being fully treated, citing financial reasons. Despite being a doctor with a private clinic, a house, and a well-off family, David was extremely stingy, even towards his son. Due to David's decision to take his son out of the incubator early, the child ended up with a disability. The important thing is that life continued for them, dealing with whatever situation came their way, accepting it as their fate. Meanwhile, Dr. David's problems with Dr. Jessica kept escalating to the point where it led to physical violence. Once he hit her so hard that it caused a significant wound on her mouth. The wound was so severe that Dr. David, being a doctor, stitched it himself. When Jessica's mother found out about this, she told her daughter that she must get a divorce. She said that if her husband thought it was acceptable to lay hands on her to this extent, she had to leave him. Dr. Jessica asked for a divorce at that time, but later felt that the divorce would create a significant problem for their 3 children, especially since they had just had their 3rd child. She decided to stay with him for the sake of their children, not wanting them to suffer. Jessica didn't share all the details of her problems with her family because she was raised to believe that the household secrets should remain private. Jessica devoted her entire life to her children, providing for them in every way, including financially, as Dr. David was very stingy with them. To cope with her overwhelming thoughts, she started documenting everything in a private journal where she would express her feelings and daily events. It was a way for her to vent and record the things she couldn't or was too embarrassed to confront her husband about. In 2021, on the 3rd day of Christmas, Dr. Jessica stayed home, writing in her journal. After she finished, she took her children out to run errands. When Dr. David came home and found them gone, he called her and started a big argument about how she dared to leave the house without his permission. Jessica explained that she had tried calling him multiple times, but his phone was off. Once he verified this by checking his messages, he fell silent, although it was clear he was looking for any excuse to pick a fight. After ending the call, Dr. David noticed Jessica's journal, which she had accidentally left on the table. He took it upon himself to read through it and discovered everything she had written about his family, his stinginess, and his violence. When Jessica returned home with the children, Dr. David confronted her with the journal in hand, accusing her of writing such things. Jessica tried to explain that it was a personal way for her to vent and that nobody else knew about the contents. However, David loved to argue for extended periods. The argument lasted for hours, and Jessica finally exploded, saying everything she had been too embarrassed to tell him directly. Their voices escalated, and despite his family hearing the commotion, none of them tried to intervene. By 2:30 a.m., Jessica called her mother, expressing her fear of David and his increasingly violent behavior. Her mother tried to calm her down, saying it was natural to have minor conflicts and that David was still her husband. After hanging up with her mother, David, feeling even more enraged, went to the kitchen, grabbed a knife, and attacked Jessica in front of their children, stabbing her more than 11 times initially and continuing until he had stabbed her 17 times. His family heard the noise but assumed it was just another argument and did nothing. After Jessica died in front of her children, David opened the apartment door and fled. The children's screams finally prompted his family to check on them, finding Jessica lying on the floor, drenched in blood. Instead of immediately calling for help, they spent 2 hours cleaning up the blood before finally taking her to the hospital at 5 a.m. The doctors, upon seeing the stab wounds, immediately contacted the authorities, as it was clear they were dealing with a murder. When the police arrived and confirmed Jessica had been killed, they contacted her family, struggling to break the news that Dr. David, a fellow doctor, had murdered her with 17 stab wounds in front of their children. David was on the run, but within days the police apprehended him in Alexandria, where he was hiding in a vacation rental. David was arrested and put on trial in one of the most high-profile cases of the time. After thorough investigations and collecting all the evidence, he was sentenced to death in 2021. However, in 2024, his sentence was commuted to life imprisonment due to new evidence and legal appeals. Legal experts can better explain how and why such a change in the sentence occurred, but it seems that a life sentence would be a harsher punishment for someone like David, who now faces a lifetime of suffering, having lost everything: his life, his wife, his children, and bringing shame upon his family. Despite his respectable outward appearance as a doctor from a good family, neither education nor money could change the fact that he lacked morality and proper upbringing. Thankfully, his children were spared from his influence and are now living with Jessica's family, who will undoubtedly raise them to be respectable individuals like their mother. May Dr. Jessica rest in peace.